Imagine for a second that you live in this really bustling, mid-sized town.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, and the holidays are approaching. The downtown shopping district is just packed.
Oh yeah, total chaos.
Exactly. Parking is an absolute nightmare, and people are just complaining nonstop. So the mayor decides to do something that sounds incredibly popular, a grand gesture, really.
Uh-oh, I know where this is going.
Yeah, so he sends city workers out to put these little plastic bags over all the parking meters, and he declares, free parking for the entire holiday season, courtesy of the mayor.
Which sounds amazing, right? A total win for the public on the surface.
On the surface, exactly. But within hours, the downtown area is just completely paralyzed. Absolute gridlock.
Right, because the parking is free.
Because it's free. So the shop owners, they pull up, they park their cars in the premium spots right out front, and they just leave them there all day. Commuters park there. Nobody moves.
So nobody can actually go shopping.
Precisely. By trying to give everyone free, unlimited access to a shared resource, the mayor actually destroyed the utility of that resource for absolutely everyone.
Yeah, it's a classic trap.
It really is. Sometimes human nature just makes a massive mess of things when everyone is acting in their own, rational self-interest.
Right.
And today we are looking at exactly how governments and institutions use that precise phenomenon, like that exact flaw in human behavior, to quietly and sometimes very loudly design your life.
It is honestly a perfect starting point because it isolates the core issue so well. We like to think that when we consume information, especially news or scientific reporting, we are just looking out of a clear window at the world.
Like it's just objective reality.
Exactly. You look out, you see it's raining, and the article you're reading is just the glass. It's a neutral medium. But what happens when you realize the glass is actually curved?
Ooh, I like that.
Right. What happens when you realize it's actually a lens and it's engineered to magnify certain fears and obscure other realities?
Specifically so that you'll accept the traffic warden stepping in to manage your parking space, so to speak.
That is exactly it.
Well, that is exactly what we are putting under the microscope today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, we are not just blindly reading news. We are putting on X-ray glasses to look at the structural engineering of the news.
The plumbing, basically.
Yeah, the studs, the wiring, the plumbing of persuasion. Because we are looking at a media landscape that is just highly engineered. And I think most of us don't even realize we are walking through a building someone else designed specifically to route us into a very particular room.
Which is exactly why we need a specific set of tools for this exploration.
Right.
We're going to be using a media literacy framework from our sources today called the Clear-Eyed Decode checklist.
I love this checklist.
It's so good. It is a forensic, almost surgical tool for breaking down institutional communication. And it operates on a very simple premise, which is that institutional persuasion uses the exact same architectural blueprints no matter what the subject is.
Right, so it could be anything.
Exactly. It could be public health, it could be national security, it could be economics, or in the case of our source material today, it could be climate.
And that brings us to the primary source we have on the table for this deep dive. It is an article written by a prominent climate professor, and the premise of the piece is about recreating the legendary UK heatwave of the summer of 1976, but in today's climate.
Yes, a very specific angle.
But, and I want to plant a massive flag right here at the beginning for you listening, we are not here to debate climate data.
We really aren't.
We are completely, entirely impartial regarding the actual meteorological science, the temperature records, the atmospheric physics. That is simply not our beat today.
No, and the Clear-Eyed framework actually requires us to temporarily suspend our emotional or political reactions to the topic itself.
You have to, or you get distracted.
Right. If you are busy arguing about whether the thermometer reading was accurate, you are completely missing the behavioral operation being run on you.
Yes.
So we are focusing strictly on the architecture of persuasion. We want to know, how does this article use language?
And how does it leverage authority?
Exactly. How does it use computer modeling, striking imagery, and this manufactured sense of urgency to basically instruct the public on how to feel?
I want to go back to a phrase you used when we were prepping for this conversation, because it has been rattling around in my head ever since.
Oh, yeah. Which one?
You said, the weather is the subject, but behavior is the target.
Yeah, that is the golden rule of decoding institutional messaging.
It just perfectly encapsulates what we're looking at.
It really does, because when you read an article about a heat wave, your brain automatically categorizes it as weather news. You think, oh, this is about temperature records. I should maybe go buy a fan.
Right. Or wear sunscreen.
Exactly. But the Clear-Eyed framework tells us to stop, take a breath, and ask a fundamentally different question. What does the author of this communication want to do to your attention? What do they want to do to your assumptions? And ultimately, what do they want to do to your behavior?
So the weather is just the vehicle.
The weather is just the delivery mechanism. The payload, the actual purpose of the article is how you behave, what political policies you consent to, and what restrictions on your personal life you just accept as inevitable.
It's essentially a masterclass in reading the matrix. So let's look at how this article sets its trap, because the setup is incredibly clever.
It really is.
The author takes the summer of 1976. Now, if you aren't from the UK, or, if you just weren't around then, 1976 is this massive cultural touchstone over there.
Oh, absolutely. It's legendary.
It is the gold standard for British heatwaves. It featured 15 consecutive days where the temperature stayed over 32 degrees Celsius, which is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which is a lot for the UK.
Huge. There were severe droughts. They had to set up emergency public water taps in the streets because the reservoirs were running dry. It was a massive deal. So the article takes that specific historical memory and asks, well, what would happen if that exact weather pattern occurred today?
And it's a very potent, very deliberate hook. They are starting with nostalgia, you see.
Yeah, they're grabbing you by the memories.
They are anchoring the reader in a shared cultural memory. People who lived through 1976 remember it as a tough time, certainly, but also as a natural, survivable, almost romanticized summer phenomenon.
Right. People remember eating ice cream, playing in sprinklers, dealing with the heat as a community.
Exactly. But the article doesn't stay in that memory. It performs this very subtle sleight of hand. It takes that historical reality and runs it through a modeled counterfactual.
Yes, because the headline literally reads, and I'm quoting here, "We recreated the legendary heatwave summer of 1976 in today's climate. Here's what we found."
There it is.
And this is where my alarm bells just started ringing, based on the very first rule in the Clear-Eyed Decode framework, which is you have to separate observation from a model.
This is where the X-ray glasses really start to reveal the wiring. One of the most common and honestly most effective tricks in modern institutional communication is taking a modeled hypothetical scenario and dressing it up in language that makes it feel emotionally like an observed historical fact.
Yeah, it feels real when you read it.
But the article claims they recreated 1976. Let's be empirically precise here. They didn't recreate anything in the physical world.
No, they didn't build a time machine.
Right, they ran a computer simulation. They wrote code that compared a past event to a hypothetical present. It is a projection. But the language they use, like we recreated, here's what we found. It presents it to your brain as if it has already occurred in reality.
I was actually trying to come up with a way to explain how bizarre this is if you apply it to literally any other field.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so it feels like, imagine someone is running a physics simulation in a video game, right?
Okay.
They program a digital version of my car crashing into a concrete wall at 80 miles an hour. Right. And then a journalist writes a breathless front-page news report treating that digital simulated crash as if I actually physically just broke my legs in real life right now, and they demand I go to the hospital.
That is a phenomenal analogy. It really is, because it isolates the psychological mechanism at play there.
It's just wild when you think about it like that.
Well, when you read that news report about your simulated car crash, you were being asked to experience the emotional trauma, the adrenaline spike, and the panic of broken legs, based entirely on lines of code.
Yeah.
Our source material refers to this specific tactic as a psychological bypass. By presenting the mathematical model as a physical event, the reader is encouraged to emotionally experience the model as historical fact.
So they completely bypass the critical thinking part of the brain that says, wait a minute, this is just a guess.
Exactly. The model stops being a scientific tool for exploring possibilities with wide, uncertainty bands. It becomes the sermon.
The sermon, wow.
It becomes a definitive decree about reality that you are simply not allowed to question. You are expected to react to the simulation of a 45-degree heat wave with the exact same visceral fear as if you were currently standing outside in 45-degree heat.
And what makes this so fascinating to read with these X-ray glasses on is that the text actually, it trips over its own reality at one point.
Really.
There is this massive, almost comical, logical whiplash in the middle of the article. Let me just lay this out for you.
Go for it.
So in the second paragraph, the author is establishing the context, and they openly admit that the actual real-world summer of 2025 in the UK had, and this is a direct quote, 3 shorter heat waves rather than 1 long one.
Okay, so shorter heat waves.
Right. So the observed physical reality that everyone just lived through was shorter heat waves. But then, literally a few paragraphs later, the text insists that because of continued emissions, UK summers will inevitably have more frequent, more intense, and longer heat waves. Wait a minute. Am I crazy, or did reality just give us shorter heat waves, but the model is telling us we need to panic about longer ones?
You aren't crazy at all. That tension is extraordinary, and it perfectly illustrates the dominance of the model over observation in this specific type of narrative architecture.
It's like they just ignore what just happened.
They do. The observed reality, the shorter heat waves of 2025, is acknowledged, but almost begrudgingly, just in passing, and then it is immediately overpowered, suffocated really, by the modeled projection.
It just buries it.
Right. The model claims that the 15 days over 32 degrees in 1976 would magically become 15 days over 35 degrees today, and it warns of future projections hitting 40 or 45 degrees.
It's essentially asking the reader to ignore the summer they just physically experienced and instead panic about what the computer says they could experience.
Yes, and a clear-eyed reader has to spot that whiplash. The text is demanding that you emotionally experience the 45-degree model while simultaneously erasing your own memory of the actual observations of the summer they just cited.
It's kind of gaslighting.
It is. The framework gives us a very clear directive here. When projections and observations diverge, your job as a media-literate citizen is to question the assumptions built into the model.
Rather than just automatically worshiping the output of the model.
Exactly. But the article absolutely does not want you questioning the assumptions.
Yeah.
It wants you sweating. It wants you feeling the heat of the model.
Which transitions us perfectly into how they make you feel that heat, because it's not just the computer models doing the heavy lifting here, it's the adjectives.
Oh, the prose is heavy.
It's the prose itself, yeah. And this is where we apply the next rule from the checklist, which is spot colored terms.
This is an essential practice. Colored terms are emotionally loaded words that carry a predetermined verdict before any actual evidence is even examined.
They tell you how to feel before giving you the facts.
Precisely. They are designed to substitute an emotional response for a rational evaluation.
So I sat down and I actually did a language audit of this article. I just went through with a digital highlighter and picked out the adjectives and descriptive phrases.
What did you find?
It is a dense thicket of panic. We have temperatures described as record-shattering. A 35.1-degree day is explicitly called staggering.
Staggering.
Yeah. The weather conditions are dangerous. The population is vulnerable. Britain's entire way of life will become unrecognizable.
That's a big one.
Huge. The need for action is urgent. And then the absolute grand finale, the ultimate trump card phrase, we have no choice.
Wow. If we take those terms and run them through the neutral translation machine provided by the Clear-Eyed framework, the shift in the tone of the article is jarring.
It really is. It just deflates.
It completely deflates the panic. Let's take the word unrecognizable. That is not a scientific term.
No, not at all.
That is a civilizational fear trigger. It implies the end of your culture, the end of everything you know and love, a descent into an alien landscape.
Like Mad Max or something.
Exactly. But if we strip the color away, the neutral empirical translation is simply, future summers may differ significantly under certain scenarios.
Wow. Future summers may differ significantly. Really doesn't make me want to overhaul the global economy, you know?
It doesn't have the same punch.
What about staggering? They call 35-degree staggering.
The neutral translation is simply, a high temperature was recorded.
Okay. And dangerous heat wave conditions.
Neutral translation. Heat can pose risks, especially under certain conditions.
Okay, so this brings up a massive question for me. If the author of this article is a scientist, a literal professor of climate science at a university, why are they writing like a Hollywood scriptwriter pitching a disaster movie?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why use all this disaster theater language instead of just giving us the dry empirical data and letting us make up our own minds?
Because of what the framework calls the behavioral payload. The goal of this communication isn't to impartially inform you that a temperature reading was statistically high. The goal is to bypass your rational processing centers and trigger involuntary attention. Propaganda, and I want to be clear here, I am using that word in its structural academic sense, not necessarily as a cheap insult. Propaganda works most efficiently when it hits your fear, your outrage, or your sense of pity.
And the article is absolutely ruthless about this. It actually goes straight for the parental protection instinct.
Which is the strongest one.
It is probably the deepest, most irrational protective mechanism humans have. There is this incredibly vivid section in the piece where it paints a picture of teenagers sitting in stifling exam halls, sweating, trying to secure their futures.
Yeah, that imagery is very deliberate.
And then it pivots and asks how your elderly parent would cope recovering after surgery in a hot hospital ward. I mean, they are really turning the emotional screws there.
That is precisely the payload delivery system in action. By invoking the image of your child suffering in a stifling exam hall or your vulnerable parent sweating in a hospital bed, the article achieves total emotional capture.
You can't help but feel it.
Right. It dramatically compresses the gap between a stimulus and your response.
Yeah.
When you are terrified for your child's academic future or your mother's health, you do not stop to logically ask, wait, what were the statistical uncertainty bands on this 45-degree computer model?
Yeah, nobody thinks about the urban heat island effect when they're picturing their mom in a hot hospital.
Exactly. You don't ask about variables. You just demand that somebody, somewhere, do something to stop the threat.
You just surrender. Which brings me to that phrase I highlighted earlier. We have no choice. I want to really dig into this because the way it is deployed in the text is incredibly manipulative, I think.
It is very structured.
Towards the end of the article, the author says, we have a choice. As a global society, we have the choice to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Okay, fair enough.
Right. Global choice.
But then, literally in the next breath, when talking about adapting our domestic, everyday way of life, it says, we have no choice about that.
This is a textbook example of a managed choice structure. It is a brilliant piece of behavioral steering, actually, and you have to look at how the agency is distributed to the reader.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the public is offered a grand, sweeping moral choice at the abstract, global level. Like, we can save the world by cutting emissions. It makes you feel empowered.
Right, I'm part of the solution.
Yes. But when it comes to the domestic, local, practical level, the way you commute, the way your home is heated, what kind of car you are allowed to buy, how your neighborhood is zoned and redesigned, you are explicitly told you have no democratic say.
Ah, I see. It's the illusion of choice. You can choose to agree with the overarching moral narrative, but you have no choice but to comply with the local restrictions that actually impact your daily life.
Exactly. The Clear-Eyed Decode reveals that the word adaptation in this specific context doesn't just mean buying a better air conditioner or wearing a hat. Adaptation is a soft, scientific-sounding word for policy compulsion. It is the rhetorical crowbar that opens the door to new building standards, transport limits, behavioral nudging campaigns, and severe planning controls being imposed upon you.
Wow.
And why must you accept them? Because, well, the professor in the model said, we have no choice.
Okay, this is where things take a turn in the text. And honestly, this next part is where my jaw genuinely hit the floor while reading the source material.
Yeah, this is the big one.
Because if you read closely enough, sometimes an article forgets it is talking to the public. It stops trying to persuade the reader and it turns around and starts openly instructing the press.
The mask just slips completely off.
It falls right off, yes. This is undeniably the most revealing part of the entire text. It ceases to be an analysis of historical weather data and transforms into an open, brazen instruction manual for media narrative management.
Let's hear the quotes.
I am going to read these two quotes word for word because I want you listening to hear exactly how this is phrased. This isn't subtext, this is literal text.
Go ahead.
The author writes, quote, "Journalists should report that greenhouse gas emissions, primarily from burning fossil fuels, have made all heat waves hotter and more deadly than they would otherwise have been."
Okay, very prescriptive.
And then immediately following that, quote, "And they should use photographs of the serious consequences of extreme heat instead of those of people fortunate to be enjoying time at the beach."
It is astonishingly direct. You rarely see the internal memo published in the actual article.
Right, but let me push back on this for a second because I want to play devil's advocate here.
Okay, let's play.
Let's say I'm a photojournalist. It is 35 degrees out, it's a sunny July day, and the local beach is absolutely packed. There are 10,000 people out there eating ice cream, splashing in the water, having a fantastic time.
Sounds like a great day.
Right. If I take a picture of that beach and put it in the newspaper, isn't that just objective, accurate reporting of what is physically happening in the real world on that day? Why is the author calling that a problem?
Because while it may be factually accurate, It is the wrong emotional frame for the behavioral payload the institution is trying to deliver.
Ah, go ahead.
This is what our Clear-Eyed framework identifies as visual behavior design. Think about the psychology here. If the public sees a front-page photo of a crowded, happy beach, their brain processes the heat wave as a desirable, or at least highly manageable, summer event.
It looks like a holiday.
Exactly. That image completely undermines the urgency. It dissolves the fear.
It totally ruins the narrative that Britain is becoming unrecognizable and dangerous. If people are having fun, how can it be an unrecognizable hellscape?
Precisely. By explicitly instructing journalists to hide the beach photos and instead actively seek out and use images of serious consequences, maybe a dried-up riverbed or a distressed elderly person, the article is demanding that the press manufacture a specific, curated emotional reality for the public.
Manufactured reality.
It is an open instruction about two things. First, the approved conclusion. Journalists must always assert fossil fuel blame, ignoring any nuance about urban heat islands, atmospheric blocking patterns, or historical cyclical variability.
Just ignore all the complex science and blame the one thing.
Right. And second, the approved emotional imagery. Journalists must ensure the public feels fear, not joy.
It's essentially a scientist telling a journalist, do not show the public reality if that reality isn't scary enough. Curate the reality, show them the consequences so they will accept the restrictions.
Which proves the initial thesis of our deep dive. This is not science reporting. This is climate behavioral communication parading as explanatory science. It is narrative engineering, pure and simple.
That is a deeply chilling realization.
It changes things, doesn't it?
It really does. If you realize the images you're seeing are curated specifically to make you compliant, it changes how you look at every news homepage.
You start seeing the wiring everywhere.
Which naturally brings us to the next massive question. If journalists are being openly instructed on how to frame the news, who exactly is doing the instructing? Where do they get their power?
Yes.
This takes us to auditing the authority and this concept in our sources of a procedural dictatorship.
The framework insists that we must always audit the authority. You can't just read the headline. You have to look at the bottom of the article, look at the disclosures, look at the institutional backing that gives the author their platform.
So we look at the footnotes of this piece. It's written by a professor of climate science at the University of Reading. Throughout the text, it heavily references the Met Office, which is the UK's National Weather Service.
Very prestigious.
Right. The funding disclosures at the bottom show financial support from UKRI, which is a major government funding body, and the EU Copernicus Climate Change Service, with references to the UK Climate Change Committee.
Okay, so a lot of heavy hitters.
I mean, that is a massive, impenetrable wall of institutional prestige. If you're a layman reading this, you just think, well, they have all the badges. They must be right about everything.
And that is exactly what the badges are designed to do. But the clear-eyed rule here is crucial to memorize. Expertise is an input, not a verdict.
Expertise is an input, not a verdict. That is such a sharp distinction.
Is fundamental.
So if I'm understanding this right, it means that just because someone is a decorated professor, we aren't saying their temperature measurements are false. We aren't denying the input. The thermometer really did say 35 degrees.
Right, the data is the data.
But it means they are using their institutional prestige to preload trust for their political verdicts. They are using their authority in meteorology to substitute for evidential quality when it comes to their behavioral and economic demands on society.
Exactly. Being an expert in atmospheric physics or measuring ambient temperature does not inherently make you an expert in how a global economy should be restructured.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't make you an expert in the sociology of energy poverty or the ethics of restricting travel. Auditing the authority means recognizing that this author does not exist in a vacuum. They exist within a vast institutional ecosystem that actively, structurally benefits from a permanent state of climate urgency.
Because if there is no emergency, the funding dries up.
Precisely. The research grants, the relevance of the university departments, the expansive regulatory power of the climate committees, the budgets of the NGOs, all of it is entirely reliant on the continued public acceptance of a crisis.
Right.
If the public sees a beach photo and decides the heat wave is just a hot summer day, that entire institutional architecture loses its leverage.
Which connects so brilliantly to the secondary source material we reviewed about the architecture of procedural dictatorship. Because we have to step back and ask, how does an article like this actually function in the real world?
How does it hit the ground?
Yeah. How does it fit into a society where, as the source points out, We have elections that change the political managers, but somehow never change the actual outcomes or policies.
This is where the structural analysis gets really profound. When people hear the word dictatorship, they picture a guy with a mustache in military fatigues shouting from a balcony.
Right, a very cinematic dictatorship.
Yes. But a procedural dictatorship is much quieter and, honestly, much more effective. It's a system where all the democratic forms still exist, you still have campaigns, you still cast a ballot, but the actual outcomes, the major policies that dictate the physical reality of your life, are managed by an unaccountable bureaucracy.
The source material lists things like net zero mandates, emergency public health powers, digital surveillance rollouts. These sweeping civilizational changes are almost always cross-party.
They are.
They are rarely debated in any meaningful way during an election. They are just implemented by agencies.
And how are they justified to the public? By the continuous declaration of an emergency. When institutions, exactly like the ones funding our article, successfully use their prestige to declare a climate emergency, a fascinating legal and political shift happens.
What happens?
The courts and the elected parliaments defer to the experts.
Mm-hmm.
The law fundamentally changes its nature. It stops being a mechanism to limit government power and protect the citizen, and instead becomes a post hoc justification for the government to manage the citizen.
Okay, so connecting the dots here. When this article demands urgent adaptation and explicitly tells the public we have no choice, it isn't just a rhetorical flourish.
Not at all.
It is actively laying the psychological and political groundwork. It gives regulators and unaccountable advisory boards the moral cover they need to enforce new building codes that you can't afford, or ban the sale of certain types of cars, or restrict how often you can fly.
Yes.
And they can do all of this without ever having to put those specific, incredibly painful lifestyle changes on a ballot for a public vote.
Because the science has already dictated that there is no choice. The loop of a procedural dictatorship relies on three distinct parts working in harmony.
Okay, what are the parts?
First, experts generate models that predict catastrophe and demand compliance. Second, the media is instructed, as we saw openly in the article, to enforce the emotional urgency and hide any contrary imagery.
Hide the clutches.
Hide the beaches, right? And third, politicians point to the media and the experts to justify bypassing democratic debate. The ordinary citizen is entirely comprehensively boxed out of the decision-making loop.
It's a perfectly closed loop of authority. And honestly, it makes you wonder how we got here. How did we arrive at a place in Western democracies where society just broadly accepts this kind of top-down coercive behavioral management as normal or even morally necessary?
It didn't happen overnight.
No. To understand that, you actually have to go back to 1968, to a highly influential essay by a biologist named Garrett Hardin.
Yes. To understand the modern reflex for coercive institutional management, you have to understand the philosophical bedrock it is built upon. And that bedrock is Hardin's essay, The Tragedy of the Commons.
Anyone who has taken a college-level environmental science or economics class has probably heard of this. It's basically the foundational text for modern environmentalism and behavioral nudging.
It's taught everywhere.
It is. But let's outline Hardin's premise for you listening, because its logic is incredibly seductive. It makes so much sense on the surface.
Seductive is exactly the right word.
Right.
So Hardin asks the reader to picture a shared pasture, a commons, that is open to all the herdsmen in a village.
Okay.
There are no fences, no rules, just shared grass.
Right. And Hardin says, assume every herdsman is a rational actor trying to do the best for his own family. So, the herdsman looks at the pasture and asks himself a simple mathematical question. What is the utility to me of adding one more cow to my herd?
Right.
Now, there is a positive component and a negative component to this choice. The positive component is that the herdsman gets all the meat, all the milk, and all the money from selling that one extra cow. It is a +1 benefit entirely for him.
But the negative component is the overgrazing caused by that one extra cow. However, and this is the crux of the tragedy, the negative cost of that overgrazing isn't borne by him alone.
No, it's shared.
It is shared by everyone in the village.
So the math absolutely dictates his behavior. He gets a full +1 benefit, but he only suffers a tiny fraction of a -1 penalty.
Exactly.
So as a rational human being trying to feed his kids, the only sensible course of action is to add another cow, and then another.
But every other herdsman in the village does the exact same rational calculation. They all add cows. And the inevitable result is that the pasture is completely destroyed.
The grass is gone.
The grass is gone. The cows starve, and the village starves. As Hardin famously and bleakly wrote, Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all.
It is such a powerful narrative because it feels true. We see versions of it everywhere in modern life. It's the exact same dynamic as the free parking in the town that I mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
The bagged meters.
Right. The mayor bagged the meters, making the parking a commons. Facing an increased demand for a scarce resource, everyone acted in their own rational self-interest. They grabbed a spot and refused to leave. The result was total gridlock. The resource was destroyed.
Yep.
When you see that happen, it really does feel like you need a referee. You need someone to step in and stop people from ruining things.
And that is exactly the conclusion Hardin reached. Because he believed humans are fundamentally selfish and driven by localized self-interest, he argued that we cannot rely on appeals to conscience.
You can't just ask nicely.
No, you can't just ask people to do the right thing. In fact, Hardin went deeper into the psychology of this. He argued that appealing to someone's conscience actually creates a damaging psychological trap called a double bind.
Okay, this double bind concept is fascinating. Walk me through how the psychological trap works in practice.
Imagine the government runs an ad campaign asking you to voluntarily drive less to save the planet, appealing to your conscience as a good citizen.
Okay, I've seen plenty of those.
Right. Hardin argues you're actually receiving two contradictory messages at the same time. The intended overt message is, be a good citizen, leave your car at home.
Got it.
But the unintended covert message you internalize is, if you actually do this, while everyone else ignores the ad and keeps driving, you're a simpleton. You are a sucker who could be shamed into standing aside while others exploit the commons.
Oh, man, that hits so close to home.
Right.
That is exactly the feeling you get when you spend 20 minutes meticulously washing and sorting your plastic recycling, making sure there's no food residue on it, and then you look across the street and see your neighbor stuffing car batteries and paint cans into the regular trash.
It's infuriating.
You feel guilty if you don't recycle, but you feel like an absolute sucker when you do. It's cognitive dissonance. It's psychologically exhausting.
Exactly. Hardin saw that exhaustion. He realized that voluntary compliance simply does not work against rational self-interest. So his ultimate solution, and this is the phrase that essentially built the modern administrative state, was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon.
Mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. It sounds, I don't know, almost democratic. Civilized.
It is carefully designed to sound democratic, but what it practically means in execution is that human freedom must be heavily, forcefully curtailed by coercive laws, complex taxing devices, and vast administrative management.
Basically, force.
Yeah. Hardin was actually quite extreme in this view. Because he viewed the whole earth as a commons, he even argued in his essay that the freedom to breed was intolerable because human overpopulation put too much strain on the global commons. He believed coercion was the only path to survival.
Okay, so Hardin's theory sounds incredibly logical, tight as a drum. Freedom equals ruin, therefore coercion is necessary for survival. This philosophy is why it became the bedrock for so many of our modern policies.
Yes.
But this is a massive structural but. The Clear-Eyed framework demands we challenge it, because if we don't, we are just accepting the architecture without checking the foundation. This is where we break the model.
We have to break the model because Hardin's essay has a fatal, almost astonishing flaw. It is a blind spot so large you could drive a truck through it. But it requires putting on our X-ray glasses again to really see it.
Let's do it. Let's dismantle this. Where did Hardin go wrong?
Hardin observes the selfish herdsman perfectly. He analyzes the self-interest of the ordinary, everyday citizen with incredible precision. But he is completely, utterly blind to the selfish custodian.
The custodian, meaning the manager. The regulator, the bureaucrat who is put in charge of the pasture.
Yes. Hardin assumes that ordinary people are dangerous, greedy, and destructive when pursuing their self-interest. But he simultaneously, almost magically, assumes that institutions and regulators become perfectly responsible, pure, objective, and altruistic the moment they are given authority.
Which is quite an assumption.
It's absurd. As the brilliant critique in our source material puts it, Hardin notices the wolf at the village gate, and his solution is to hand the keys of the village to a committee of wolves with clipboards.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here again because this is what a lot of people listening might say. Sure, bureaucrats aren't perfect, but isn't a government committee staffed by highly educated experts and climate scientists objectively safer than a chaotic mob of selfish people acting blindly?
It is a very fair question, and it is the default assumption of modern society. But the Clear-Eyed framework thoroughly dismantles it by looking at the mathematics of scale.
Mathematics of scale.
Yeah. A selfish farmer can overgraze his cows and damage one field. He can cause localized ruin. But a malicious, corrupt, ideologically blinded, or simply corporate-captured custodian can restrict food, energy, movement, speech, and housing across an entire civilization.
Ah, I see. Valentant scales infinitely better than selfishness.
Exactly. The ordinary exploiter acts locally and has limited reach. The institutional exploiter acts through the levers of state power,
Yep.
law, taxation, licensing, metrics, modeling, and public messaging.
It's systemic.
Think back to our climate article. If the institutional ecosystem decides that the commons is no longer just a village pasture, but the global atmospheric temperature, they can use that framework to justify restricting literally anything.
Because everything affects the atmosphere.
Right. They can dictate whether you are allowed to drive a petrol car, how warm you are legally allowed to keep your own house in the winter, what kind of meat you can buy, or whether teenagers are allowed to sit exams in normal conditions.
Once the commons becomes the master frame for the whole planet, literally every human action can be reclassified as a threat to a shared resource. And therefore, every human action requires control by the custodians.
And Hardin never applies his own cynical calculus to the managers. He assumes the herdsman will cheat the system for a cow. But he never assumes the regulator will cheat the model for a multi-million-dollar grant, or for political power, or to force a societal transition they ideologically favor.
He just gives them a pass.
He doesn't ask the crucial foundational questions that the media-literate citizen must ask.
And those questions are the missing half of the argument. These are the questions you have to ask every time you read an article demanding urgent action.
What should we be asking?
Things like, who gets to define the emergency? Who owns the proprietary computer model that proves the emergency exists? Who sets the carbon quotas? Which corporations profit from building the compliance mechanisms? And most importantly, who audits the custodian when the custodian becomes the predator?
Hardin's phrase, mutual coercion usually agreed upon, sounds perfectly fine until you stop and ask. Agreed upon by whom?
Right.
Was it agreed upon by the actual people whose lives are being restricted? Or was it agreed upon by regulators, international bodies, and academic institutions that actively manufacture public consent through fear campaigns?
Like explicitly telling journalists to hide photos of people having fun at the beach.
Precisely. If the media is hiding the beach photos, the mutual agreement is based on a manipulated reality. So the public consultation can be staged. The model can be tuned to produce the scariest result. The perpetual crisis can be declared.
And anyone who points out the reality, anyone who says, hey, wait, the heat waves were actually shorter this year, is instantly branded as selfish or anti-science or a denier of the commons, which leads us to the ultimate reversal. The real punchline of this whole deep dive, the tragedy of the commons becomes the tragedy of the custodians.
It is a profound, paradigm-shifting realization. Granting total power to an institution doesn't abolish the tragedy of the commons, it merely relocates it.
From the people to the managers.
The pasture is no longer overgrazed by the villagers trying to feed their families. It is enclosed by the managers. It is financialized by corporate insiders. It is rationed by expert committees. And the whole theft of public agency is justified by beautifully colored terms like sustainability, necessity, and urgent climate action.
Wow. Okay, let's bring this all together. Let's recap the journey we just took you on, because we covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really did.
We started with what looked like a harmless, slightly nostalgic article about the summer of 1976 and a computer model predicting the weather. Just another science article on a Tuesday.
Seemed totally normal.
But by putting on our X-ray glasses and using the Clear-Eyed Decode checklist, we uncovered a vast hidden architecture of behavioral steering. We saw how language was manipulated to trigger fear.
The color terms.
We saw emotional triggers specifically aimed at parents' deepest instincts. And we saw massive institutional power grabs all, intellectually justified by this deep-seated philosophical fear of the tragedy of the commons.
We observed the specific mechanics of how a computer model was deceptively substituted for physical reality. We saw how observed, empirical data that contradicted the panic narrative was minimized and brushed aside.
The logical whiplash.
And most revealingly, most shockingly, we saw how the press was openly, brazenly instructed to manipulate visual imagery to guarantee public compliance with an elite agenda.
So as is tradition when we use the Clear-Eyed framework, we have to deliver the plain English translation.
Let's do it.
If we take that original climate article and we strip away the colored terms, we strip away the institutional prestige, and we strip away the emotional manipulation, what is the actual neutral structural message of that text?
The plain English translation of that article is simply this. The article tells journalists to frame heat through fossil fuel blame, use alarming imagery instead of ordinary summer imagery, and prepare the public to accept urgent lifestyle adaptation as unavoidable.
Which is a very, very different thing to read than a scientific report about the weather. It's not an atmospheric analysis, it's an instruction manual for your consent.
It truly is. And this is why this framework is so vital. The clear-eyed citizen isn't someone who automatically rejects every scientific claim. We aren't saying the climate isn't changing.
Right.
The clear-eyed citizen is simply someone who refuses to be emotionally hurried past the evidence. The goal isn't to be a blind contrarian who rejects everything. The goal is to become impossible to administer through manipulation.
Impossible to administer. That is the goal. I love that phrasing. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week.
Something to keep in mind.
If our modern institutions truly believe that mutual coercion is the only viable way to save the planet, and they are so utterly convinced of their own moral righteousness that they are openly instructing the media to hide the beach photos to manufacture your consent, who exactly is auditing the custodians while they are busy auditing you?
A question that becomes more urgent and more necessary by the day.
Keep your X-ray glasses on, everyone. Next time you read a scientific headline, don't just look at the glass. Look for the wiring. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of persuasion. We'll see you next time.